and the kinds of services that we provide for veterans, children, students, accreditation programs for workforce programs in the country. And in a vast majority of the states, it's the match for digital resource funding, which is a major issue for us in Texas and I know elsewhere as well. And of course, libraries promote digital literacy. So if anyone says to me, do libraries still have books anymore? Yes, don't even let them finish the sentence. But we are a hybrid environment, and we're here to talk about literacy, whether it's paper or digital literacy. So we know that libraries truly transform, and we know there are approximately 120,000 libraries in the country, and in some way, federal funding or federal support, however it's parsed out, supports all of us. We're not just fighting for money, though, and I would remind delegations that when we go to the Capitol, the florists go to talk about rules and regulations for flowers that will ultimately end up as profit for them. We go for our constituents. We go to bring people to the notion of what we do and what a value we are, and as we all know, what a wonderful return on investment. We fight for our core values, and as you well know, a number of our core values are at risk now for all types of libraries. And that results in our fight for an open and free internet. And I often point to what I call the perfect storm of the majority of federal, state, and local agencies who have all or most of their materials online at a time when we are taking away the ability to access those. And I use the very good Pew statistic, which talks about the fact that 25%, if not a little more, of the people in our country do not have access to technology, and another percent of our population doesn't have access to the kind of technology. So we're not dinosaurs. We are an integral part of the economy, as the Washington office has so clearly stated in the papers that we currently have on veterans and the libraries mean business content. We are currently also fighting for a balanced look at copyright. And I don't do copyright interviews because I consider it one of the more difficult areas to talk about. So I've given all that to Jim, who will be president, and he's a copyright specialist, as are the people at the Washington office. So we are in for a fight just to explain to people what our role is in this variety of areas we're fighting for. Science, climate, whatever it is you're talking about right now, we can bring that back to what libraries do and what libraries provide. So whether you're here in Washington or whether you're watching this on the webcast, do we know yet? Is the webcast working? Or whether or not you watch this a little bit later as we start. Is it working? Yeah. Oh, hey, welcome, country. We are working toward equal access to information for people in this country and elsewhere 24/7. So we really want to focus on the variety of roles that we have. And I think the word 21st century is hackneyed, but I still continue to use it, but I just use as many pieces of data as I can to make this article important for people. Make any article, make any interview. So before we bring up our speaker, I'd like to introduce someone, Lori Rivas. Lori? Come on up, I believe. Lori is the winner of the 2017 White House Conference on Library and Information Services, or what we call the WICLIST Award. It was established in 1991, and like all WICLIST Award winners, Lori is not an expert librarian, though that might be changing. Are you going to go to library school?
Yes.
Good. You, however, have been on the front line of libraries since 2010, I believe, and that was when her hometown of Santa Clarita in California proposed contracting with a private company for the management of their public libraries. Now, I'm going to read this. It sounds like you're saying it. So as a mother for her homeschooled children, Laurie saw her public library as an indispensable part of her children's education. She was galvanized for action to keep her local public libraries truly public. In response to the proposed contract, Laurie helped organize a campaign that gained national attention. You secured a private audience with your elected leaders, always a risk. You testified before her state legislature, and she's been interviewed by a number of outlets, including Democracy Dies in Darkness, Washington Post, my favorite statement of the day. She's campaigned for library services during local elections, and you've written a great deal to local media. Her advocacy work eventually led her to become a library consultant for Southern California Library Cooperative, where she helped implement LSTA grants and learned a lot about the value of IMLS funding. Please join me in congratulating Laurie Rivas for receiving the Wicklist Award. Laurie. Am I supposed to have an award? Just take it. I'm taking it home if she doesn't get it. So now we're supposed to pose for pictures with this imaginary award. Come here. It's very real. Okay. And then we'll let you say a few words. That's good. Laurie?
Thank you very much for welcoming me into your community of radical public servants. I'm honored to be here.
And I have jobs. Thank you so much. I just told Laurie I have jobs if she's interested in coming to Texas. I would now like to introduce our keynote speaker, who is a fierce defender of democratic principles, Hina Shamsi of the American Civil Liberties Union. Hina is the director of ACLU's National Security Project, which is dedicated to ensuring that U.S. national policies and practices in security are consistent with the Constitution, civil liberties, and human rights. So right now, full-time job. As a lawyer with the ACLU for more than 10 years, Hina has litigated cases upholding the freedoms of speech and association and challenging targeted killings, torture, unlawful detention, and post-9/11 discrimination against racial and religious minorities. Hina's work includes a focus on the intersection of national security and counterterrorism policies with international human rights and humanitarian law. Before coming to the ACLU, Hina was the acting director of the Law and Security Program, Human Rights First. She's also served as a senior advisor to the UN on extrajudicial executions. What coursework did you take for that? That's... There you go. Right answer. ACLU, as you know, is no stranger to ALA. We've worked with them throughout the years, and the phrase that the Washington office put in here, because they know, worked at the hip with ACLU back more than a decade in a fight to protect personal privacy in the U.S. Privacy Act. ALA and ACLU are going to begin working again very closely a little later this year when a key provision of the Federal Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is Section 702 of FICA, is set to expire. Hina is a powerful voice for protecting privacy. She appears regularly in the media and has been quoted as a national security expert by numerous outlets, including the failing New York Times, which is, I think, at an all-time high right now for people reading it, the Washington Post, the Associated Press, and Reuters. Hina has appeared on MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, NPR, ABC News, and the BBC. She's the author and co-author of numerous publications and has monitored and reported on the military commissioners and issues at Guantanamo Bay. She's also a lecturer in law at Columbia, where she teaches a course in international human rights. We are honored to have Hina Shamsi with us today. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium, and we will exit the podium, I think.
I hope I don't mess anything up by moving this. Good morning, everyone. Julie, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And I'd also like especially to thank Adam Eisgrau, who has been an ally of ours at the ACLU for many years, and I think was instrumental in inviting me to speak today. So here we are, day 102 of an unprecedented presidency, and there is nowhere else I would rather be. I'd like to talk today about the connections between the ACLU and the ALA to start, some of the work that we at the ACLU have been doing and the challenges I see ahead, and work that we are focused on together, including especially Section 702, which we're going to be talking about over the course of today and later. I hope it goes without saying, but the ACLU's work with and respect for librarians is long-standing. You know this about yourselves, but I'd like to recognize just a few things that I think are so critically important in terms of what you mean to us and what you mean for this country. Librarians have been the ACLU's allies, clients, and heroes in defending the access to information and free expression while protecting the right to keep their inquiries and interests private. You know that the freedom to read and receive ideas is at the heart of individual liberty in a democracy, and you guard that freedom every day. You seek to satisfy any information need, be it for research on historical documents, reading, fiction, poetry, health information, tax and legal documents, naturalization and immigration requirements. You provide information, access, and protect your patrons' right to explore new ideas, no matter how controversial they may be. Across the country, you make it part of your mission to serve veterans, as Julie was mentioning, and also the most vulnerable and underserved user groups, including those who are unemployed, homeless, recent immigrants, and refugees. Often partnering with ACLU affiliates, librarians around the country have taught and provide workshops on how the freedom of speech and the right to privacy are compromised by surveillance of online and digital communications. And you help provide new privacy-protecting services to shield patrons and constituents from unwarranted surveillance of their library activity. You know, I think, that when government officials, including law enforcement or immigration agencies like the FBI or the DEA or ICE, seek to access patrons' user records or digital histories, that kind of access sends fear within communities, and it chills the exercise of the right to seek, disseminate information, and to even associate with others. You recognize the dangers of self-censorship that arises in a society in which those rights are chilled. You know that our democracy, our memory, our collective memory, and our collective future require free intellectual inquiry. And when those values and rights are threatened, so many of you have been on the front lines, and you have made a difference, and you are making a difference. Having the opportunity to address you today, I would be remiss in not recognizing just at least a couple of our clients who've been librarians and heroes to us. And one of the key cases, I think, which is especially timely at this point, was a challenge to the Patriot Act's National Security Letter provision. You might recall that as originally passed in 2001 and then reauthorized and amended, the USA Patriot Act, in particular its Section 215, gave the FBI the power to request library borrowing records, patron lists, computer hard drives, and internet logs. 2 years after the passage of that statute, 4 Connecticut librarians and the president of a New York Internet Service provider stood up against the Patriot Act and refused to violate the privacy of their patrons and their clients. 4 of those librarians, representatives of Library Connection in Connecticut, became our clients at the ACLU. Barbara Bailey, Peter Chase, George Christian, and Janet Nosek received NSLs from the FBI, but they were gagged from revealing that the FBI had sought information about them. Instead of complying with those broad requests, which were issued without any judicial oversight, the librarians joined the ACLU in bringing a legal challenge. And as a result of that challenge, the FBI dropped its gag order on the librarians. And I think just as importantly, the story of what happened, the fact that after that gag order was dropped and the librarians were able to speak out, helped the country understand how broad and sweeping the powers were and brought it really home to people at a very fundamental daily level, the ways in which their civil rights and civil liberties were under attack, and the ways in which important pillars of communities around this country, librarians, were going to stand up and educate people about what was at stake and why it mattered, not in a way that is partisanship, but in a way that is about what this country stands for and what everyone's rights are under this Constitution of ours. And for that reason, we were very proud, and I'm very proud to say, that the ACLU gave our premier honor, our Roger Baldwin Medal of Liberty, to those librarians in 2007, because that work was so important and because it really helped change the kinds of debates that would result later on in what was called the USA Freedom Act, which, as I think you all know, is by far from perfect, but nevertheless helped achieve important reforms, showed that there was a desire for reform in this country, and showed that it was possible, including in what was still then a very tough time, for Congress to pass those reforms. And that was a starting point for something that we thought might be a better direction for us to go in. Instead, we find ourselves at a rather different place. And back last summer, when it appeared that then candidate Donald Trump was going to be a serious candidate, and indeed when he won the nomination of the Republican Party for the presidency, we at the ACLU thought that it would be very important to examine his policy campaign promises alongside those of candidate Hillary Clinton. And we did both. What we found, though, with candidate Trump is something that in many ways you are all very familiar with, but for us was also significant cause for concern as we reviewed promises about immigrants, refugees, surveillance, privacy, minorities, important aspects of this country's most important values. And according to our analysis, policies that then candidate Trump was examining would flagrantly violate the First, Fourth, Fifth, Eighth, and 14th Amendments to the US Constitution. And so in some sense, we were trying hard to be prepared for whatever the outcome of the election would be. And then November 9th, November 10th, we all woke up and thought, all right, this is something that we have to do. These are unprecedented times, and so they have proven to be. Our work, as you perhaps know, is most in the public eye right now for our challenges to the Muslim travel ban, the ban that applies to 7 majority Muslim countries, and that since its inception has started to tear apart families and targeted very vulnerable people, refugees, obviously, primarily. We were able to succeed so far in putting a stop on that ban. We have an argument coming up, my colleagues in our Immigrants' Rights Project's argument next Monday, which will, in a first, be audio live streamed on C-SPAN, so I would encourage you all to listen to it next Monday when they're arguing in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. But that's only one important part of our work, and my work especially. We have heard and are concerned about and working on challenges to excessive and long-term detention and interrogation at the border, including detention, interrogation of citizens and legal permanent residents. I was detained just a few days after the Muslim travel ban was put in place, as I was coming back to the United States after depositions with our clients in a lawsuit against two of the psychologists who devised and helped implement the CIA's torture program. The questioning that I received in Puerto Rico when I was transiting at the border was not about that lawsuit. Instead, the Custom and Border Protection agent asked me how it was that someone representing and working for an organization with American in its name would have the passport that I then had, which was a Pakistani passport. It was a set of questions that I had never been asked in my decade plus of being a legal permanent resident of the United States. I was asked why it was that someone who worked for an organization with American in its name could be representing non-Americans. How it was that I could be working for an organization, how our organization could be suing Americans. It was an opportunity to educate the Customs and Border Protection agent. But at the same time, I have to tell you, this is not new, right? This kind of questioning, border questioning, including of Muslims, has been happening for years now, including under the Obama administration. I think we have to be very clear-eyed when we look at the challenges ahead. We've got to think about the challenges and what has brought us to this day. And so I have certainly represented clients who've been questioned in this way and questioned about filmmakers and journalists who've been questioned about their activities and their travels abroad. But it gave me a revitalized and renewed perspective, because even with all of the privilege I have, the knowledge that I have as an ACLU lawyer, I've stood up in court, you go dry-mouthed when you have the power of the state stopping you and looking at you in this way. And I know viscerally, I've known and tried to empathize always with my clients, but there's a very visceral sense that I think more and more of us have now of the dark times that are upon us and the things that have been unleashed. And so it becomes critically important, I think, for all of us to consider the many ways in which we work together and the challenges that we take on together. And so that brings me to surveillance issues, and one of the topics that you are going to be focused on, and I'd like to talk to you about that a little bit. So on January 20th, President Obama handed then-President, incoming President Donald Trump, the keys to what has become our nation's surveillance state. President Trump has at his disposal the National Security Agency's incredibly powerful technological tools. He also has at his disposal the benefit of overbroad and unconstitutional surveillance authorities that were embraced by the Obama administration, which give tremendous discretion to executive branch officials. Now, as I said, we've got to be clear-eyed about what has existed in the past. And so these spying powers have long been cause for concern because they violate our core rights to privacy, freedom of expression, and freedom of association. But they are now wielded by a president who previously invited Russia to hack his political opponent, who reportedly eavesdropped on his own hotel guests, and who has called for the expanded surveillance of Americans and especially American Muslims. These authorities seem all the more frightening. So let me then talk to you about Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which you're going to be talking to your legislators about. Thank you for doing that. Section 702 allows the government to warrantlessly monitor Americans' international emails, web browsing activities, and phone calls with the assistance of companies like Facebook, Google, AT&T, and Verizon. The government has relied on Section 702 to carry out mass surveillance on US soil, including through 2 programs revealed by the whistleblower Edward Snowden, PRISM and Upstream. Generally speaking, under 702, the NSA targets any non-US person abroad to acquire what's called foreign intelligence information, which is incredibly broadly defined to include foreign affairs information as well. Through the use of this authority, the government has been able to collect countless communications, including, from journalists, human rights researchers, and ordinary citizens abroad, including their communications with Americans. Through Upstream in particular, the NSA scans communications entering to and exiting the United States. It then gets to retain any communication that is, quote, to or from would have been approximately nearly 100,000 targets, as well as those that mention certain identifiers associated with those targets. And those identifiers can include email addresses or phone numbers. What that means, in other words, is that the NSA has the ability, through targeting others, but is also sweeping up Americans' communications, to search through the contents of Americans' international communications in bulk and without a warrant. And it retains those communications even when they are merely about the targets. This deeply problematic aspect of upstream collection, known as about surveillance, has now, as of last week, and this is new information that I want to talk to you about today, reportedly been reined in. The NSA indicated last week that it would stop the collection of surveillance of virtually all text-based communications entering or exiting the United States. If this is true, and depending on the details, always important, this is a significant step forward in the fight to restrict the NSA's extremely expansive surveillance powers. But this is also important. Unless Congress codifies this restriction, there is a real risk that the practice is going to be resumed. And the NSA's change still leaves in place a warrantless surveillance scheme that sweeps up countless Americans and must still be reformed. It's critically important to note that the government isn't relinquishing its powers in announcing the changes that were announced late last week. We have no reason to believe that the government is disavowing the authority to conduct this expansive about surveillance, even though this surveillance violates the Constitution. Rather, the government seems to be stopping the practice because of technical problems that prevent it from complying with an order of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court that oversees, albeit deeply imperfectly, these kinds of activities. In 2011, this very secretive court found that the NSA was violating the Fourth Amendment in retaining and searching certain wholly domestic communications collected under Upstream. See, the problem was that the NSA wasn't able to filter out those communications because of the way that the internet functions. Because messages are transmitted over the internet in bundles, the agency was retaining many purely domestic communications that had nothing to do with its targets. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court ordered the NSA to adopt stringent procedures to protect our domestic communications from warrantless searches by NSA analysts. But according to news reports, the NSA told the Intelligence Court that it had been able to meet the technical requirements that were imposed on the court, which we think is the basis for the changes that were announced last week. It's still unclear to us whether the NSA is ending about surveillance voluntarily or in response to a still secret FISC decision that was handed down earlier in this year. And yes, this is a problem, which is that we have a court that oversees and sometimes approves certain intelligence activities that can include and implicate our constitutional rights as well as the rights of people abroad. And those decisions are kept or can be kept largely secret despite reforms that have been put in place. What's fundamentally important, though, is that the news that you might see now and be asked about doesn't suggest an end to the NSA's global dragnet. The agency continues to target an incredibly broad category of people using both upstream and PRISM, different kind of surveillance, and it is still incidentally collecting and searching enormous amounts of information to and from Americans. That's why it continues to be critically important that you press, as you're going to do, with respect to your legislators, with respect to privacy rights. There's a vigorous debate that's taking place and heating up around Section 702. And if the NSA's powers are ever going to comply with the Constitution and with the privacy rights that you and we think are so critically important, then many, many more significant reforms are needed. You will no doubt, in the next, I know my time is running out, so I'm going to close up because I want to leave some time for questions as well, including about other aspects of the ACLU's work to the extent I can answer them. But you will, no doubt, in the next 4 years minus 102 days, I didn't do that calculation, face a number of challenges, and so will we. I recognize the extent to which there are so many important funding issues that you face, and just reading the news, the challenges that come from not having the strong kind of libraries system and librarians in this country is a diminishment of our democracy, I think. I hope and expect we're going to continue to work together in very, very important ways. Again, you have been our colleagues, our allies, our clients, our heroes. I expect you will continue to be. And I look forward to working with you in many ways in the years that lie ahead, but also especially now. Thank you so much. I believe I have a few minutes for questions, and I'd be glad to answer them. Goodness.
We're not letting you off the hook, that is. Hi, folks. I'm Adam Eisgrau. Thank you so much for being here this morning, and thank you to Hina as well. Hina, tell us a little bit more, if you would, about these confusing program names that people hear. Folks in this room may have paid attention to the revelations from whistleblowers and others over the last year. PRISM, Upstream. Upstream is now called something else. PRISM is called something else. Downstream, very clever.
So you all know Adam, and I'm going to do, what sometimes people do to me, which is, Adam, you're an expert on these issues. And you're going to be talking about them. So do you want to start and we'll have a conversation?
Well, I suppose we can. Let's broaden it out a little bit. So this notion of mass surveillance, folks in this audience have heard we at ALA in Washington, otherwise at prior alleged days, talking about bulk collection, mass surveillance. And a number of people in the audience, if I were in the audience, I would be thinking, wait. We had this whole big Section 215 fight. Didn't we end bulk collection? Isn't what that was all about? You said we still have mass surveillance. How's that happen?
Right, so Section 17 was just a very particular authority that was put in place in 2001 with respect to particular kinds of records. when after President Bush's warrantless mass surveillance program was revealed as a result of public reporting, instead of reining it in, Congress passed Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act's amendments in 2008. And 702 supposed to be pretty restricted, right, in some ways, but what it actually does and what it was set out to do as government officials essentially admitted at the time, was not to be limited to targets that are solely foreign and solely abroad, as traditional FISA had done. And it was not to be restricted in terms of the kinds of constraints and safeguards, including probable cause requirements. And it was not to be restricted to people abroad. It was very much meant to sweep in Americans' bulk records of particular kinds, including especially those that travel over the internet. And so these are the authorities that have been put in place, that have been abused, that continue to be violated with respect to the Constitution. And we've brought challenges, right? We've brought challenges under the Fourth Amendment, under the statute as well, and we're waiting for those challenges to play out in the courts. But if there's anything that all of us know, it's that sometimes courts can take a while, and that court cases require also broad support. I'm not sure that we would have had as quick or as great a response, for example, to our Muslim ban cases had we not have tens of thousands of people coming out across the country essentially saying this is not who we are, this is not what we are. So part of the efforts that we're talking about here with respect to 702 and the different kinds of programs that exist under it is the kind of debate that is going to take place later this year and the ways in which those reforms need to take place to ensure that unlawful searches, retention, collection, and use of information does not return or expand.
So we hear about this incredible technology the government has. Now, you couldn't possibly, I mean, give me a break, you couldn't possibly listen in to the entire internet, could you? He said leadingly, knowing the answer to the question.
You can, and they do, and that's the short version of this. And among the challenges that we face in legal arguments and litigation, but that it's also important to know, is that the government says, well, mere collection doesn't violate the Fourth Amendment. It's only when we use it that it violates the Fourth Amendment. To which we say, well, give me your diary. My mere collection of it won't violate your privacy rights. And just trust me to keep it under lock and key. And maybe I'll tell you if I open it, maybe I'll provide you notice, but usually I won't. How does that make you feel?
You know, these lefties go way overboard, don't they? I mean, you know, we don't have to trust them. We have a court overseeing this entire national security apparatus. Aren't you forgetting that? He said, knowing the answer to the question.
I know, I think this is slightly unfair. I want to know whether other people have questions as well. So I think, one of the key Snowden revelations was the confirmation of something that I think many of us had suspected, which is that this court, which had been set up, and you will all know, and if you will know that this was part of the reforms put in place by the Church Committee, right, which had undertaken an investigation and found that over decades the intelligence community had been collecting information of Americans' information using the technology then available in violation of Americans' rights. And what had resulted was a set of reforms, including the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. This was supposed to be a restrictive measure. It's now turned into a permissive measure, right? And part of the struggle that we've had ever since 76 and so on is to go back to and have this tussle back and forth with the government with respect to our fundamental argument that safety and liberty have to go hand in hand. You cannot have a balance where you let one go with the other, because that's quite simply always going to result in the kinds of violations that the Church Committee found. And so one of the reforms that was put in place was to have the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. But this court was meant to do something very specific, which is to look at warrants and to review information that was based on a standard of wrongdoing being found, and with respect to particular targets, not entire programs. But among the things that became very clear as a result of the Snowden disclosures was that the court had been requested by the Bush administration and had gone along with essentially secret interpretations and reinterpretations of critically important provisions of FISA and constitutional interpretations, and we didn't know. We didn't know. Among the reforms that were put in place by USA Freedom was a requirement, or sort of essentially, you really have to tell us when you're going to arrive at novel and significant decisions. But that's been pretty imperfect still. And so much of what's been made public, and we're continuing to fight to have more made public through Freedom of Information Act requests and requests to the court itself, is so redacted or so imperfect that we really have very little information. And we still don't know, as I was saying earlier, whether the new announcement from the NSA results from a still secret order that we should know, right? And so where we are still is in the midst of this very necessary debate where our rights are still being violated, where privacy and the access to privacy rights and access to really intimate information about us that the government may now have and store, and a deeply flawed system of oversight. And that's what I think faces us.
Aren't we lucky she's on our side? Hina Shamsi.
There you go.
I'm going to do something my staff is not going to understand at all, which is actually stay on time. It's just about 10 o'clock. A quick reminder that we'll be taking a 15 and only 15-minute break. Actually, I tell you what, we're going to take a 13-minute break. I'm lying. Please be back here at 10:15. We've got 6 presenters, 10 subjects to cover, and a lot to rock and roll on. If you've got questions about any of this or anything else, you know how Lucy mans the little stand and it says the doctor is in? We have Emily Wagner, our terrific information manager in the Washington office. You can tweet her a question at #NLLD17, and magically you will get an answer. See you all back here, 10:15 sharp. May I ask folks in the lobby to grab two people and bring them back in the room? Ladies and gentlemen, we will be beginning in 1 minute, and we need you. Please take your seats. Ask your friends to take their seats.
Do you need me to start yelling at
Maybe. What are you going to say? Adam needs it? Now it's time for the issue briefing. Kindly take your seats.
One, two, test 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, testing 1, 2, testing 1, 2.
Don't make me ask you again. Take your seats, please. We're talking no video games for a week.
Would anybody with a baseball bat please go out to the lobby and begin clubbing people? Nicely.
Five, 4, 3, 2, 1.5, 1 1/4, 1. All right.
Thank you, everybody. Welcome back. Did they have the little chimes in the lobby, you know, where they always get them out of order and it sounds weird when you're being called to dinner?
Places, everyone.
All right. Thank you, everybody, and welcome back. It is customary in the United States for somebody to say that and silence to follow. May I have your attention, please? Hey, it's either me or Emily. Make your choice, you know? As a hush falls over the audience. Yes, I knew that was going to work. We're going to miss her. How are we going to get people to be quiet? Thank you, everybody. Welcome back. We have, as I said before the break, 6 presenters making, you ready? Click, click, that's the sound of seatbelts. 10 presentations before we finish the issue briefings. We have a hard stop on those at 11:45. And by hard, I mean hard. There is a lot going on in Washington, you may have noticed. The badge asks, as you've seen on the back, cleverly, of your badge, are all about money. And I promise you, we will talk about federal appropriations and what you can do about it while you're in Washington, what you can do about it when you go home, what you can do about it while you're dreaming, what you can get your neighbors to do. That's later. We'll talk about funding soon. In the meantime, it's not like the rest of government stopped, and that there are no other issues, as you certainly heard amply described by Hina Shamsi. Wasn't that great? Not incidentally, she came down late last night on the train and is leaving momentarily to go back to New York. So we are very grateful that she came down. So we have issues that we care about, and librarians and libraries and their patrons care about, pertaining to government information, pertaining to copyright, pertaining to various aspects of telecommunications that you will hear about, privacy and surveillance, of course, and federal funding. And to tell us about those, he said, positioning the cursor and hoping the slide comes up. Maybe not so much. There we go. Are all of these nice folks. Yours truly and my colleagues. Carrie Russell is already here with us in eager anticipation, actually at my request, of the copyright panel. Emily Sheketoff is hanging on barely, just for the adulation that we all appropriately owe her. This is going to be fun today, ragging on Emily, isn't it? Yeah, I think so. And in the short run, let's immediately turn to government information. Well, immediately was the cue of the slide. There we go. So the government information.
I'm not the only person who has technological problems, Mr. Know-it-all.
Do you have any idea how much money ALA has wasted on scribes and stone tablets in the last 17 years? It's half of the Washington office budget has gone to stone tablets for Emily. No, not true. Dead trees. So the government information access universe, as this slide clearly shows, really is very simple. Only a librarian, and thank heavens we got a whole bunch of them in the room, because I ain't one of you, unfortunately. Only a librarian really understands how complicated a government we have, how broad the issue sets. I see lots of people earnestly trying to decipher this on the screen. That is definitely to your credit, but it was actually not intended. So relax, it's okay. Nobody understands this. There's a lot to keep track of. The public needs to know a lot, or at least have the option of knowing about a lot. And as a consequence, the ALA Office of Government Relations has provided a handy-dandy one-pager in all of your packets, and to go to the Hill, that I'd like to very quickly run through so you understand, at least in a little bit more depth, what we're talking about. I should also note that there is a separate breakout Q&A session later with the staff of the Office of Government Relations and our colleagues from the Office for Information Technology Policy, to whom we are indebted for helping us with this briefing today as well, so that any follow-up questions that you have can, and I hope will, be answered in that follow-up session. So what is hot right now that we care about? Well, because the universe has kind of a nasty sense of humor, particularly as it relates to OGR's and the Washington office's prep for Ledge Day, a new bill was introduced last Friday. It's so new that unless Emily Wagner stands up in the back of the room and shouts at me, it doesn't even have a number yet. This is a good thing, because it's called the Preserving Data in Government Act. And two senators, bipartisan pair, Gary Peters of Michigan, the Democrat. Way to go, Michigan, yeah? So we know how to say thank you if we're going to be in the senator's office, don't we? Yes, we are going to say thank you for the Preserving Data in Government Act. And also Senator Cory Gardner, a Republican from Colorado. Where are you, Colorado? Are you sure? All right. The Preserving Data in Government Act would require federal agencies to preserve public access to existing open data sets and prevent the removal of existing databases without sufficient public notice. And this is for public, and it makes a point of saying it's also because small business relies on a lot of these data sets. So brand new information, you're finding it out pretty much about the same time as we did. The Preserving Data in Government Act is something we would like senators to support. That is not on your one-pager because we had the nerve to print those before last Friday late afternoon. What we did tell you about, however, was something that Julie Tadaro had the following statement about, which is referenced specifically on the Government Info one-pager. Our nation's founders, Julie said, knew that maximizing Americans' access to information of all kinds, including particularly about the actions of the federal government, would be critical to the survival and security of our democracy. The open, public, electronic, and necessary, that, by the way, is where OPEN in the name of the bill comes from, the Open Government Data Act, this is different than the one that was introduced Friday, is sensible, bipartisan, and profoundly democracy-building legislation, and the American Library Association is proud to commit to working for its fastest possible passage. Now, what could Julie possibly have had in mind with Ledge Day coming up? You think? So, as the one-pager says, we would like to enact, and we would like to ask you to ask the people you are meeting with to please enact S-760 and H.R. 1770, and that will require all federal agencies to publish their information online using non-proprietary, machine-readable formats. Important. In past years, the bill numbers are S-760 and H.R. 1770. That's on the one-pagers that you've got. In the past, we have strongly backed, and we will again when it is reintroduced, or something like it is reintroduced, a bill called FASTER, F-A-S-T-E-R. We are of the radical, we ALA is of the radical opinion that if the taxpayer funds research and that research produces articles, that the articles should not, for time immemorial, be locked behind a paywall. Lots of negotiations went into the bill that was introduced last year. It resulted in a compromise. Life is not perfect, where there would be a period of time, a year I believe, that there would be proprietary access through the journals that the papers were submitted to, but then these papers, which were based on publicly funded research, would become broadly and widely available for no charge. We'd like that. And then, as you'll see on the one-pager, we would like any number of things. Thank you. News to me, my apologies. We will figure out how to rectify that if we can. Congressional Research Service reports, also paid for by the taxpayer. It would be very nice if those were broadly available when they aren't confidential to the taxpayers at large. There is a long history of what we would respectfully argue is overreaction in opposition to that by some, including some in the Congressional Research Service itself. Bills have been introduced to try to rectify this. In the meantime, these reports are, in fact, courtesy of 2 members of Congress and a nonprofit organization, are in fact universally available. But just as Hina was suggesting that we can't rely on unilateral government action without actually writing it into law in order to get where we want to go in terms of legal reform, surveillance in that case, access to information in this case, we need to have that codified. And then, of course, we will also be keeping an eye on funding for the Government Publishing Office and the archives, and we would like to make sure that databases held by the National Technical Information Service also remain available. The fate of that agency is unknown, and that was true before any suggestion of budget cuts. So that's the quick roundup, perfectly explaining everything you see on the screen there. The most important things when you go out on your advocacy visits, if you've got particular concern about access to government information, please mention those 2 bills that I highlighted at the beginning, and say thank you to the sponsors if you happen to be from Michigan and Colorado. We are very glad Colorado is here. Just to make it clear, I'm kidding. With that, I'm going to rely on our breakout Q&A session. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so we'll be rocking and rolling here on a few of these subjects. We will have Q&A sessions on our 3 telecom-related subjects, and we will have a Q&A session on funding immediately following each of those presentations. But for now, he said, in a shameless segue, turning to prepare Carrie in her general direction, drum roll please, copyright. Well, we've got a diagram that's, almost as simple there. This is actually a much easier concept, if I can figure out how to make this work again. Come on. There we go. That is intended to be a library where there are many, many aspects of copyright resulting in warning signs and restrictions. And if you look closely in the window, the copyright squad in a black and white car with binoculars peering in the window. Carrie will tell you why we care about copyright, and in particular, why we care about a treaty that is pending. Ms. Russell.
Good morning, everyone. I want to tell you that in June 2013, there was a miracle in Marrakesh. What happened in Marrakesh in June 2013 is that the World Intellectual Property Organization passed an international copyright treaty that was an exception to copyright. First time ever in the history of international copyright law. This exception is called the Marrakesh Treaty, and it is about providing access to print material to people who have print disabilities. Print disability people are either blind, they have low vision, they're dyslexic, or they have some disability where they cannot handle a book. So it's a wide number of people that have print disabilities. In fact, 285 million in the world. The treaty will allow a country that signs on to, ratifies the treaty, it'll allow that country to share and borrow accessible content across borders. In the United States, we have the Chafee Amendment, which allows us to make copies for people with print disabilities. In many other countries, they do not have such an amendment. So the Marrakesh Treaty makes countries across the world, when they ratify it in their individual country, it makes them have that exception. If somebody is blind and they need to have an accessible copy, it is not an infringement of copyright law to make them an accessible copy. Now, the cool thing about this is that we can share those accessible copies across borders. So, if there was an English language country in Africa that wants some accessible copy that the United States has, we can give them that accessible copy. Now, it sounds like this is just all good. It's we want people to read, right? We want all people to be able to read. But I must tell you that this whole treaty was very, very controversial. We worked on it for 4 years. We had an excellent U.S. delegation fighting for the treaty, and I want to tell you that under the Obama administration, that was a high point for information access in this country. That was our high point. And they really worked hard on developing this treaty with all these other countries, and it passed. There was one copyright official, I remember though, however, that said, this treaty is premature. It's premature, what do you mean? It's too soon to let blind people read? I don't get it. But yes, indeed, that was what she said. But nonetheless, this treaty did come to pass in June 2013, and we were very happy. Now, what has to happen is that 20 countries have to ratify that treaty in their national law. 27 countries have done that thus far, which means 27, which means that in those countries, the law has taken effect. So Canada is one of the signatories. They can share their content with somebody in Australia. And a lot of the countries that signed on are in developing countries where a lot of people that are blind have absolutely no access to information. Unfortunately, in the United States, our country has not yet ratified the law to include it in our copyright statute. Why? Well, again, it's very controversial. There are rights holders that did not want, here's their argument. It's not economically viable for us to make accessible copies right from the beginning because we don't really have a market for those. Instead, we're not going to provide accessible copies. We will want you to ask us for an accessible copy, and then you will pay a fee for that accessible copy. So for the publishers, this was a very difficult thing to swallow. But it did happen. And a couple people got fired that, weren't successful in stopping it. Yeah, there was somebody in the International Publishers Association that got fired because they weren't successful in preventing people from reading. So, but now what we have now is we had some difficulty with our ratification packages. The Publishing Association did not like some of the things that was in the ratification package, and they wanted to stop the legislation. The Libraries Associations, we met with the publishers over a 6-month period and worked out some language that we now all agree on. The treaty is good to go, but it hasn't come forward yet in the Senate. The Senate has to pass this treaty. Now, the problem with the Senate is they don't usually like to pass international treaties because the attitude is, we're not going to have some United Nations body tell us what to do. So there's like 36 treaties that have never been passed. This is one that needs to be passed now. So when you visit your folks, we're asking, especially the Senate people, when you visit your senators, to ask them to look for, push forward, let's have the Marrakesh Treaty in the United States. We're the wealthiest country. We have the most information to share that's accessible. We need to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Could I ask our telecommunications panelists to please take the stage? While they are doing that, let me tell you briefly, very briefly, about a couple of other copyright matters we're watching, again, on the one-pager. We would certainly like modernization of the Library of Congress broadly to take place, and specifically as it relates to copyright, the Copyright Office, which pretty much all stakeholders, public sector, private sector, visiting Martians and Venusians, all think that the office is a technological backwater. They are all right. The General Accounting Office agrees with them in multiple studies, so it's time to really fully fund the effort to modernize the Copyright Office. That's something we wish to happen there. What we don't wish to happen, point 2, is for the Copyright Office to leave the Library of Congress, which some, including some in the publishing industry, no offense to our publishing friends who are here, wish to accomplish. They have indicated to Hill staff, that has in turn talked to us, that step 1 in moving the Copyright Office out of the Library of Congress is to arrange for the Register of Copyrights to become a new presidentially appointed position. In other words, the next register, there is presently an acting register and a vacancy, the next register would be appointed by the terms of this bill that has just passed the House of Representatives, would be appointed by the next president, not by Dr. Hayden, who was, in our view, hired to modernize the Library of Congress, modernize the Copyright Office, and to put her own management team in place to do that. So, as it indicates on the sheet, H.R. 1695, which did just pass the House by a very substantial margin, I might add, now moves to the Senate. We're not exactly sure what its fate is going to be there, but we oppose H.R. 1695. We are all in favor, however, of mostly staying on time, and I'm going to tell my staff so they don't have heart failure that I will steal time from the surveillance presentation that I was going to make later because Hina Shamsi covered so much wonderful ground for us. So we will be on schedule, I promise. And in the meantime, we get to hear about various aspects of telecommunications. That will mean Lara Clark, the Deputy Director of the Office for Information and Technology Policy, talking to us about net neutrality. It will mean Marika Visser. Hello, Marika. Talking to us about the E-rate, which happily does not appear to be in immediate danger. It is not being talked about at Ledge Day because things are on fire for a change. And third, not last, Kevin and Lara will be talking about the importance as Congress eventually, not short-term, turns to dealing with what it may mean to improve America's infrastructure, that include broadband, particularly broadband in libraries, and include libraries as critical infrastructure themselves, the facilities themselves. And if I have the ability to change slides, I will do so momentarily. Lara, take it away on net neutrality. Please, go right ahead, Kevin.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're just going to have sort of a conversation here about we have about a half hour to talk about the telecommunications infrastructure issues. So, you know, is this on? Okay. All right, thank you. Is this on? Can you hear me in the back? Okay. Can you hear me now in the back? Yeah, all right, thank you. I'm Kevin Maher, and I am happy to be here today, joined by two of my colleagues, Lara Clark and Marika Visser. And we have about a half hour to talk about the telecommunications issues, and you have the information there in your packet. So first, Marika, Lara and I are going to talk a little bit about net neutrality, which has become a hot issue lately. And I want to start just kind of throwing out the question, what do we mean when we talk about net neutrality?
Thanks, Kevin. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us here. It's my pleasure to be with everyone. So I think we have a rough sense of network neutrality here, but I would say the ins and outs of this can get a little complicated. At the most, I think folks hear about it more like fast lanes and slow lanes. As far as the internet and how can you prioritize traffic, and do the big guys get to buy faster access via the internet to reach people, and also giants like Google or Facebook or others paying to move their traffic more quickly. But it can also mean no lanes. So for anybody who on your data plan, has, like, hey, no cost if you want to stream NBC programs because NBC and Comcast are affiliated, that is a network neutrality issue, right? Like, so if you can cut deals, so in the library, if you are a Comcast subscriber, that may mean that your library can offer better access to NBC programming, but that may not be your priority in the library. So it's fast lanes, slow lanes, no lanes. Fundamentally, net neutrality is the idea that all of the internet traffic should be treated equally, and the internet service provider should not be the gatekeeper. The consumer, the library, the broadband, the person paying the broadband cost gets to decide what they want, not the ISP.
So I saw one analogy I liked is, imagine 5 companies owning all of the highways in the country, and they get to decide who gets to drive on the highway, how much you're going to charge, and the highest bidder gets the express lane. And if you can't afford that, you're on the slow lane with the potholes, and you have to make all the stops and wait behind everybody else. So I think that's a fair analogy of what we're talking about. But this took a while to get to this point with the FCC. The 2015 order, took a long time getting there. How did we arrive at this place? And what was ALA's role during that process?
So the ALA Council has had a couple of different resolutions and engaged saying that this is a priority for the association and for our membership. And so we've been involved in this space for close to a decade now, sadly. I mean, like so many of the legislative fights that we have, they don't ever go away. The 2015 order was the second attempt to protect network neutrality. The order was issued in 2015, but we were gearing up to do that work all the way back to 2012. And that was after the court struck down the 2010 open internet order. And ALA has been working with partners and coalition, both within the education and library community, but also within larger coalitions like the Electronic Freedom Frontier and Free Press and Public Knowledge. So we've been actively working with our colleagues in this space, but also within other broader net neutrality space. And there were several public comment periods. There were more than 4 million public comments that came not only from organizations like ourselves, but also from individual people saying that this is a priority. And we really changed where the FCC was. The FCC chairman had a much more limited plan, and they really radically expanded it based on the advocacy to move to what you may have heard of as Title II, as opposed to Title I, which gives the FCC more authority to protect the open internet. So that was a really radical shift, and it happened because of our advocacy as well as others. And unfortunately, the 5-person vote was split in 2015 along party lines. There are 5 commissioners, 2 of them from one party, 2 from another party, and then the chairman comes from whoever is in the administration. And 2 of the dissenting votes included the current FCC chairman, Ajit Pai. So you can see where that brings us to today.
Thank you. And the courts weighed in at one point.
They did, yes. All of these, the one thing you can be sure of is that as soon as the FCC issues something, they will be going to court on network neutrality. It's been Comcast, it's been Verizon, apparently they like to take turns. So almost immediately after the FCC order was enacted, they went back into court. Now we had a very unusual result this time. For the 3rd time when we went to court, we were upheld. So the open internet order with the legal authority that we had fought for under Title II of the Telecommunications Act was upheld by the court. They said, yes, the FCC has the right to do this, and we affirm the open internet order, which has never happened before. So then it becomes, do we go to the Supreme Court? That was a 3-judge panel, so they could ask for the full court to look at the issue. And the internet service providers said, yes, we'd like the full court to look at it. And this was when we were down a Supreme Court member. So they're like, well, we don't know what the Supreme Court looks like, so we're not going to appeal up yet. So it's still sitting for the circuit court to make a decision about whether or not to come back to this. So it's still sitting in court, whether they will take it up again or if it'll eventually be challenged up to the Supreme Court.
And there's been a lot of activity recently at the FCC. There was an announcement last week. What's the FCC? Where's the FCC headed right now?
I think the same thing that we've been seeing in kind of all areas is that the new administration made a lot of promises, like we're going to take action right away. So net neutrality was one of the very few telecommunications issues that was on the top burner for the new administration. And as I said, a long-term FCC commissioner is now the chair, and he knows how to work the system. He's smart, he's capable, and this is a priority for him. So last week he announced that he is looking to overturn the reclassification to Title II and to start a new rulemaking, which means that everything that we were doing several years ago will start over. They've released the notice of proposed rulemaking in advance of the meeting. So the FCC public meeting where the commissioners will vote on this is May 18th. But right now the commission has 2 Republican-appointed commissioners and 1 Democrat-appointed. So we would expect that the item will be adopted, and we will start making comments again about why should we protect this open internet order. So that will be the next step, and they will open up the rulemaking. And ALA, along with many of our coalition partners, have always commented and actively engaged with the commission. So just as we're lobbying members of Congress, we are meeting frequently and talking with the legal counsel at FCC and key staff. So we will begin that process again, and also talking strategy with our colleagues, because this does not just go to the FCC or to the courts. It also is a ping pong ball with Congress. So they've been actively engaged, and you can probably talk a little more about that than I can.
Right, correct. Yeah, the Congress has been very energized and very interested in trying to do something about net neutrality. What's really particularly happened is that there hasn't been consensus. I think the Republicans realize they need some bipartisan support. And I would say, in particular, Senators Nelson of Florida and Schatz of Hawaii have been the 2 most likely Democrats to come to some sort of compromise. But so far, they've really held firm on this issue and have not really been willing to compromise. They want some of the core principles, which are actually on the back of your issue brief today, that they really want these issues addressed, and the Republicans don't seem to be willing at this point to give any ground there. So, if you're meeting with those senators, Nelson and Schatz, thank them, encourage them to keep holding the ground in the House. Congressman Pallone, Congressman Eshoo have been very strong and supportive of that. I don't think there's much wavering from their two offices. But those offices, have been very supportive of us, and we have met individually and with coalition partners in those offices and other offices on the communications committee. But let me ask, how long should this FCC process take? How long can we expect, since Congress doesn't appear at this point to be moving any legislation?
So the FCC can take whatever time they feel like they need. The public comment period is usually like 30 days and 60 days. There's a call for comment and there's a call for reply comment. And then after that, the FCC tries to make sense of all the comments they've had. Advocates go in, we all try and meet, and we all try and say, this is what we would like you to do. So that advocacy process that happens after the public comment period can go on however long. In some cases, if the FCC wants to go in a direction that they are not being supported in, the FCC will hold up until they can try and find consensus among the advocates. In this case, it may be that it would move much more quickly, as we've seen with a lot of other administrative activities, that people will say, you know what, we're going to do it no matter what. We don't care what you think, we're going in, we're going to do this, and we have the power and we're going to make this move. And then the courts come back into play. Because if the FCC were to do a radical shift and say, everything that we just did, we're taking it back, that can be considered arbitrary and capricious in the courts. So if the FCC decides to just say, we're doing it our way and the highway, like we're doing it no matter what you all think, then we may end up back in the courts. Or the Congress can become more important, because if Congress changes the authority for the FCC and says, we direct you to do this, that's a game changer as well. Unlikely under these circumstances that would be the case. But I will say one other thing about this is that no one will tell you that they are opposed to protecting the open internet. No Republican will say that, no FCC chairman will say that. They will say there should be guidelines and rules of the road. We all agree that there should not be discrimination on the internet. What they disagree about is how do we protect it? Will the FCC be the enforcement body as they have always been? Or will it be the Federal Trade Commission? Or will it be self-regulatory? So the companies will take care of this for us, and we should just trust them. So I will say, people say, of course they support the open internet, and we have guidelines that will do that. But the question is, who is going to enforce those guidelines? And what protections do we have if there's a complaint? If one of our libraries says, this is not working, I cannot get my content to my students, to my researchers, where do they go, and who will take up that complaint? Because if you're going to call one of the large ISPs, are they going to fix that for you? And if they don't, where do you go? Do you go to the FCC? Do you go to the Trade Commission? So I think the enforcement question is really the most critical part of this, because, of course, everybody loves the internet the way that it works. So how do we protect it?
So trust but don't verify is basically what...
That might be how I would call it, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think our message is clear. Is that we support what the FCC did. The courts have ruled. We don't think any legislation. We don't think any is necessary. We don't think any change at the FCC is necessary. So let me turn to E-rate. Talk about the E-rate issue here, and want to welcome Mareika with us today. She is our E-rate guru. What is the school and library program of the Universal Service Fund? What is E-rate?
What is E-rate? Yes. So I wanted to start actually with just the kind of show of hands. How many people apply for E-rate? All right.
Thank you.
How many people think they do but are not sure? Okay, so you're sure. Great. So E-rate is one of the universal service buckets under the FCC, and it is specifically the Schools and Libraries program, although we like to say the Library and Schools program. And I would encourage you, when you talk about it, to go ahead and do that, because words matter. So we're in the middle of the E-rate application cycle as we speak, so probably some of you are checking on where things sit with your applications and making sure that things are all lined up. So when you go through the review process, you won't come up into hit any slowdowns or anything like that. But every year it brings about $100 million to the library community. And we're never exactly sure what the percentage of is for libraries, but we say about 5 to 7% of the fund goes to libraries every year. And you can apply, as many of you know, because you do apply, if you're a public library, for internet access, and then all the wiring that it takes to get the internet from the door to the device. So the internal connections. And in 2014, there was a lot of modernization. I think you're going to ask me questions about that. Okay.
What happened with the modernization order?
There you go. So in 2014, there was a bunch of changes to really focus the program on internet access. And that meant that some of what the FCC calls legacy services are being phased out, voice in particular. So a show of hands, how many of you typically applied for voice? Okay. And so that is being phased out. So this year is the final year that voice will be an eligible service. And that really is to focus the funding that is available on internet access, like I say. And then within that, one of the impetuses for the modernization was to make sure in schools that kids have Wi-Fi access wherever they are in the classroom or in the buildings, because so much in schools is going to Wi-Fi and is bring your own device and the one-to-one and all of that kind of thing. So the modernization was really anchored around making sure that schools have access to the Wi-Fi. Of course, it's important for libraries as well, but during the modernization for us, we heard from our members that it was more about bringing the internet to the building rather than being as concerned about the Wi-Fi access spreading it around the building. At the time in 2014, about half of all of our libraries were at 10 megabits or less, and the FCC, among other things, during the modernization, created goals for libraries that we advocated for. And so if you are a library serving a population of 50,000 or less or fewer, you should be aiming towards 100 megabit. So you can see the discrepancy of where libraries sat in 2014 between 10 megabit and 100 megabit. If you're a library serving a population greater than 50,000, then we're really encouraging you to be thinking about a gigabit of service. So there's a huge difference between where most libraries sit and where the goals are. So we advocated for the broadband to the library as our first priority. The other things that they did during the modernization, which I know if you're applying, you probably are not agreeing with this, but to make the application process simpler. And right, and nobody agrees, nobody sees that yet. And so as those of you who are applying know that USAC is the organization that oversees the program for the FCC. It's the Universal Service Administrative Company. And they were tasked with putting everything online. And the system still has quite a few bugs, and they're still working it through. But I will say that we have seen a lot of improvements just in terms of USAC really trying to be outward-facing and customer service-oriented. And I know that right now you might not see that, as I said, but that is really the goal at USAC. So I think that their efforts are in the right place, and it's work in progress. The other thing that they did, which maybe I should have started out with, is they increased the fund by $1.5 billion. Very important. Very important. And so that meant that there was actually money for Category 2, the internal wiring. And I know in some states that libraries had not seen any internal wiring funding from almost the beginning of the program in 1998. So really we're not applying. In our libraries, pretty much we're only getting internet access and voice. But now anecdotally we've heard that it's shifting because there is that money available. And so all applications for the internal wiring were funded last year, and we expect that to be the case again this year.
And the FCC is they've issued a series of questions, and they seem to be making some noise about questioning the E-rate program. Are we?
Sure.
How much of a concern is that?
Well, it's a little bit of an unknown. Similar to what Lara was saying with net neutrality, is that as now Chairman Pai, he was also a dissenting voice on the E-rate modernization. There were 2 orders, so 2 specific proceedings, although they were all related, of course. And he was a dissenting voice on both of them when he was commissioner. So now that he's chairman, net neutrality is front and center, so we have some time on E-rate, which is a good thing. So, but we anticipate that he will be reviewing what he did not like about the orders when they went through in 2014. And we expect in particular that his interest is around making it easier to apply. So think about an EZ form for your taxes. That is what he would like to do for E-rate, which sounds good. But because E-rate is also a bureaucratic system, there's a lot of checks and balances, and as those of you who apply know, a lot of review of the application. And so we are not concerned, but we're wondering how an EZ form will actually work in practice. And student-centered is his other thing. He's very much a local control kind of person. And so thinking, rather than having the categories, which are divided between internet access and the internal wiring, why not just give libraries and schools a chunk of change that you would be eligible for and let you decide what you want to use it for? And again, that might sound good, because possibly then we could throw voice back in. So we know that voice having gone away is a hardship for many libraries. So it sounds good, but if you notice when I said in the beginning, I said student-centered. So there's not a library equivalent at the moment. So what we'll be doing in the next so many weeks and months, I think, is bringing our experts together, which includes an E-rate task force. And I know there's at least one member of the task force here today from Arkansas. Together to help us kind of brainstorm what it is that we would like to propose to the FCC, because we're anticipating that they'll remember at one point that it is the Library and Schools program, and that if it's student-centered, we need to have a library equivalent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before we turn to our next issue, I think we have our message points here that the E-rate program is, we're in the 2nd year of the program. We don't need changes at this point. We should let this go forward, and it's an important program, particularly in communities that don't have broadband connectivity. So our final issue here is to talk about infrastructure, and infrastructure, traditionally infrastructure is highways and bridges and airports, but increasingly what's being talked about is broadband. The president had made some comments last year that he would consider broadband connectivity as part of infrastructure. But one of the things I think, questions some of our members might get when they're up on the Hill is, why is high-speed broadband important for libraries and for an infrastructure package? Let me toss that out to Lara.
Well, so obviously high-speed broadband is part of network neutrality. It's part of the E-rate program. High-speed broadband powers much of what we do in our libraries, both within our buildings, whether it's self-checkout or all the people with their own devices coming into the library, school, public, and academic. But it also is how people at home reach all of our remote resources, which are increasingly important, whether that's your ebooks or your other streaming media. The internet enables libraries to be open 24/7 for people that are connected at home. So broadband is essential for us to do our jobs and to support our communities and support community access, particularly when 1/4 of Americans still lack broadband at home. So it's essential to what we do inside of our buildings, but it's also essential to people accessing library services out when our buildings are closed.
So if people are talking about broadband connectivity for the home, how do libraries benefit from that connectivity if they're bringing it to the home?
Well, one of the things that I hear from a lot of the libraries that we work with is that a lot of the statistics is that you're seeing as much and growing use of your resources online. And certainly for school and academic libraries where so much activity is happening with the resources that you broker online, and also for public libraries. If you don't have access at home, then you don't have access, right? Like at once the library building is closed. So it's incredibly important not only for the work we do and for people to have access to the digital resources that we are paying for to serve all of the people in our community, and for the databases that our state library agencies broker for all of the libraries in our states, that you only get access to those things when you have an internet connection, whether that's at home or through your library.
And there is precedence for libraries to be considered as part of broadband infrastructure, isn't there? There's the BTOP and ARA program.
Yeah, I think one of the things, the ALA is a member of the Schools Health and Library Broadband Coalition, which was created during the time of the BTOP. And part of the message is that libraries and schools and health institutions are community anchor institutions. So by the fact that we pay larger bills to support our services, we also make it possible for broadband infrastructure. We make it economically feasible for internet service providers to extend their reach and to get further into residential communities, because we are a sure customer, right? Like we're not going to cut off the internet, right? Like we are going to continue to pay our bills because it's an essential service for us. So connecting community anchor institutions, not only does it have a direct impact in what we do every day and the fact that we are able to reach everybody that is able to reach a library, but we also provide an economic incentive to make it possible to extend the reach. I think the one other thing that I didn't mention under net neutrality that I think is really important here is that library advocacy in all of these issues is so essential, because the conversation around net neutrality and the conversation about broadband infrastructure often is entirely too narrow in talking about, oh, this corporate giant and this corporate giant care about this issue and it matters to them. Well, it doesn't just matter to them, and it doesn't just matter to our patrons. It matters to us because it enables what it is that we're able to do. So our advocacy on these issues, we focus on not only does it help us achieve our missions, but it also provides direct access to our patrons, because it's not just a residential issue, it's not just a business issue, it's an education and learning and access issue, and it's essential for us to do our jobs. And too often people do not see libraries and schools in this equation. It's Google and it's Comcast and it's so our advocacy in this area is really important for people to understand what this means for education and learning in this country. So your work in this area is really, really valuable, and we hear that from our allies in this space, that we bring a really important value to this conversation. So thank you for being part of it with us.
Great, thank you. I know we wanted to leave a little time for some Q&A, but I'll just say, as you're on the Hill tomorrow, this is a particularly good time for an infrastructure discussion. The offices and committees are really kind of gathering the information and putting together bills right now. There have been a number of bills introduced, but there are going to be a lot more. The discussion is kind of in the early stage right now. So telling the story and how important libraries are for broadband infrastructure, this is a really good time for that discussion.
Thank you. Whoa, the microphone works. So I knew if I lived long enough and my hair turned gray enough, somebody would hand me a portable microphone and I could impersonate Phil Donahue. So I'm gonna. First question from the estimable state of New York.
Good morning. Thank you for what you've been talking about. One of my problems with the way we talk about net neutrality is, to be very blunt, it's not very good. It's not very clear, because people conflate bandwidth with net neutrality. And they don't understand that we're not talking about bandwidth, that telecoms can charge whatever they want for bandwidth. The more bandwidth you get, the more you pay. Net neutrality has nothing to do with that, but the way we've been talking about it doesn't help distinguish that for most people, and there's a lack of understanding. The other thing is that the current chair of the FCC is saying that the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, will be the entity that makes sure that consumers get fair access. The problem with that is that there has to be a complaint. And there has to be a complaint to the FTC that has gravitas, so that the FTC will decide to look at it. And yes, they can, if they look at it, roll things back. So I'm having a problem with how we explain net neutrality in a manner that people understand that it's not about bandwidth, and that we're not trying in any way to diminish the corporate structures from making their money.
Thanks.
Well, I would say that on the fact sheet, we explicitly say that very clearly, that this is not about bandwidth. Our principles that we adopted back when we were making this negotiation earlier, we have been very clear throughout about that. I think part of the problem for network neutrality is that people do not understand. So the alternative is the fast lane and slow lane. And I think you're right. Like when we talk about encouraging activism, we do need to explain, and I thank you for pointing that out, because it really is different. Like, it's not about paying, $10 for 10 megabits and paying $100 for a gig. When you get higher capacity, you pay a higher price, and that is not what we are talking about here. We are talking about the internet service provider serving as a gatekeeper and deciding what content will be immediately accessible to you, and will they cut deals with some providers to get digital content moving more quickly or more slowly, and that the internet service provider makes that call and not the library, not the consumer. So you're right, I would agree that it has been muddy. We have tried to be as clear as we can, and I think there's always room for improvement, so I thank you. And I share your concern about the Federal Trade Commission. I am not an expert in the FTC. I don't know how well or what the shortfalls of that are, but I know that the FCC has a very long record and a great deal of agency expertise, and they should be the cop on the block for this. We believe that they are the best body to play that role. So we would agree, and we also obviously think that self-regulation is not going to be the solution.
Thank you, Lara. We've got about 3 minutes left for the questions. One more here.
Really quick, a lot of libraries have moved to VoIP phone service. Is there hope for E-rate support for VoIP systems?
No.
Could you elaborate, but only slightly?
I'll say back to the question about the bandwidth. I guess in the highway analogy, it's bandwidth is how many lanes are available, but net neutrality is you still have these 5 companies dictating who's going to have access to those lanes and how much you're going to pay.
More like a toll road, right?
Good morning. I just want to share one of the best books that I've read that helps explain this issue is by Tim Wu, W-U, called The Master Switch. And essentially he's talking about how over all of our time, beginning with the telegram, all the way through Hollywood into where we are today, how throttling, or who holds the master switch, is really the key to the distribution piece of it. And I just highly recommend that. And I know this is a nervy suggestion in a room of librarians to recommend a book, but it's called The Master Switch.
Well, and Tim Wu is the person responsible for the term network neutrality. Like, he originated the term, so he is a very good person to read if you want to read up on the issue.
And he just wrote an editorial, I think, either in the Post or the New York Times about that.
Somebody near where I'm standing who promises to be really brief. Anybody over on this side? Okay, you're putting us back on track. Thank you. Let's thank our panel.
Thank you.
And Emily. As you may have noticed, we care about privacy and surveillance. Not to belabor the point, because Hina's presentation was really quite terrific. There are a couple of other quick things to think about. This slide, not incidentally, for those who can't quite read the little bubbles on the right-hand side coming from the crowd or even see the individuals in that crowd, they are from all over the world, and they are speaking in all kinds of different languages. And that is Uncle Sam, of course, listening in to world conversations. The fundamental problem, once again, as Hina emphasized, with overbreadth in these statutes, it's not the fundamental intention
It's not the fundamental principle. You know, who here would not like to be safe and have their families be safe? This is not about security versus the Constitution. It should be security under the Constitution. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, because it sweeps in all kinds of domestic communications, and then that information can be shared within the government and retained for a long time and sifted and searched, pulls in way too much with too little oversight. That's the issue about 702 reform, which is on your privacy and surveillance one-pager. And in light of current events, as current as last Friday when NSA made the announcement that Hina talked about, we want to emphasize that no, that doesn't solve the problem for two reasons. One, early days, we're still not entirely sure what the NSA is going to continue to do, what it's not going to do. The God or the devil, if you wish, is really, really, really in the details, and privacy and surveillance statutes are nothing if not detailed. Hina was very nice to call me an expert, but wrong. But I do know some. And what they tell me is we've really got to pay attention to those details. That's being parsed right now. The second key thing to remember about 702 reform is it's not in the law yet. If it ain't in the law, it might as well not exist. Yes, we will trust what the agency is doing and saying, and then we will verify that if they're going to terminate a practice, it stays terminated by getting the law changed so that it will in the future actually be prohibited. So the point about 702 reform on your one-pager is still very much alive. Secondly, in the 31 seconds that I have left to keep us on track, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. Who here remembers Oliver North and Fawn Hall smuggling documents in her clothing? Chernobyl. Chernobyl. Do we have Chernobyl fans? Mad cow disease. Do we have any mad cow disease fans? Does anybody remember mad cow? No, because it was 1986, and that's when the Electronic Communications Privacy Act was written. With all of the vast social and legislative familiarity with the internet that barely existed, we had a law that basically said that once a stored electronic communication was older than 6 months, because storage was really expensive and nobody stored stuff as a consequence, nobody who wrote the law could imagine that any electronic communication would ever be stored for more than 6 months, and it was expensive. Cloud? What's a cloud? It's what makes it rain. So a few decades later, to say that the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which says that the authorities, broadly speaking, do not need a warrant to get the content of your electronic communications, emails, texts, cloud-stored files, photos, Instagrams, you name it, that's not just anachronistic, that's dangerous. So the good news is we had an overwhelming vote in the House in the last Congress. We had a vote in this Congress, again by voice vote in the House, effectively unanimously passing the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. It's in the Senate. We want the Senate to pass it. That's what's there. So that's the quick tour. Thank you, Hina, for covering lots of other ground on privacy and surveillance. And now we turn, do we have a Kevin in the house? To funding, with Ms. Emily Sheketoff as well, to tell us all about the badge asks. And now we get to the good stuff.
So I'm going to start out talking about the Museum and Library Services Act. This is the legislation that authorizes the Library Services and Technology Act, the major funding for libraries. So the Museum and Library Services Act, enables the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the government agency that takes care of libraries and museums. We all love it dearly, and LSTA, as hopefully you all know, has 4 components. The grants to states, which is the bulk of the money, a population-based grant that goes to each state. It's locally based. Every state decides how they're going to use that money. In every state, there's a chief state library officer that runs the library agency. They make those decisions, and hopefully you all know how you benefit from the databases that they purchase that are available to every library in the state, public, K-12 school, academic, the training that they offer to librarians as things change in libraries, And then the specialized programs, summer reading program, veterans programs, entrepreneur programs, whatever. There's also national leadership grants, which any library can apply for. There's the Laura Bush money, which pays for the education of future librarians and new education that all librarians need, and then a set aside for Native Hawaiians and Native Americans so that every person who lives here in the United States can get access to library services. And this Museum and Library Services Act is up for reauthorization this year. It was up September 30th. And so last year, Senators Jack Reed and Susan Collins from Rhode Island and Maine introduced S 3391, which unfortunately never got enacted. And so we're moving forward. They are going to reintroduce a bill this year, so we're very thankful for that. 10 years ago, Pete Hoekstra from Michigan introduced HR 13, Lucky 13, which passed. You can't really see this, but 13. So we gave him these socks, which were Lucky 13 socks, and that bill passed, and it flew through, and we're hoping that this will fly through as well. So either when Collins and Reed introduce the bill, it will be referred to the Senate Help Committee, and then Tennessee, you need to get Senator Alexander to zip it through his committee. That's where it died last year. Or else it'll go right to a vote for the full Senate. That is highly unlikely, but you never know. We don't need a hearing. We don't need a lot of whoop-de-doo. We just need a vote. We know that you will generate the support so that it passes in the Senate. The Senate will send it over to the House. Pretty much if the Senate votes for it, the House will vote for it, and slam, bam, thank you, ma'am, we've got a reauthorization. It's important that we have a reauthorization because that says to the president, to the executive branch, that there is strong support in the Congress for this program. And so that is very important. That stops all this foolishness about eliminating the Institute of Museum and Library Services and any of the other mischief that others might attempt. So that is why we want it. It is not required that we have an up-to-date authorization to get money, to get the appropriation, but it's just a message, it's a signal, it's a demonstration that there is strong congressional support for IMLS, and so that's very important. This year, as in everything you know, it's a strange year, so for appropriations, it's just as strange. As you remember in March, Trump sent the Congress his skinny budget, skinny because it didn't have any information, but it did have a wake-up call for us, because he did want to eliminate the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Well, that's not going to happen because of you. And so we just heard early this morning that for fiscal 17, the bill that has to be voted on by Friday has a $1 million increase for LSTA. So those 144 members of the House of Representatives who signed our Dear Appropriator letter, 1/3 of the House, everybody's hearing that message. And now we need at least 51 senators to sign our Dear Appropriator letter in the Senate. That's one of the things that y'all will be doing. Every senator needs to hear from you over and over and over. When you call and they say, oh, sure, he'll sign it, and you look on the air graph that we've got and he's not there, you call again. And oh, sure, you just called yesterday, he's going to sign it, and the next day you call again. Like, their job is answering the phone and keeping a tick of how many calls for which subject. Everybody like us is making those calls. So you have to call and call and call and get everybody you know to call and call and call till you see that they've signed it. Then you can move to the next senator. Okay, so as I mentioned, the continuing resolution is up on Friday. We believe since they've introduced this bill, they know they have the votes to pass it. Then all action moves to fiscal 18. We've got the Dear Appropriator letter, which is due May 19th. Then we've got the fight for the money. Then we've gone over the first two hurdles of the Appropriator letter in the House, the Appropriator letter in the Senate. Then we need the appropriations bill in the Labor HHS Education Appropriations Subcommittee. Then we get that, and then we need to fight for that bill with the full committee. And then we need to fight for that to pass in the House and the Senate. And this is a very tough year. If a tax bill goes through, then there's less money. If the wall goes up, then there's less money. If another war happens, then there's less money. And the pool of money that we're in is finite, and the things that are in it keep growing and growing and growing. We're competing with diseases, we're competing with workforce issues, and so these are all really valid issues. So we have to work really hard, and we care about the education funding as well. In the 17 budget, the full $27 million for innovative approaches to literacy is there, but the ESSA funding is woefully inadequate. And for 2018, that ESSA funding is going to be woefully inadequate. There just isn't enough money. So if they appropriated the full funding for ESSA, it would be in the billions, and they just don't have that money. So what's not going to get funded? And that's the battle that is set up now. So this marathon that we are fighting is between now and when the final appropriations happen, and whether they happen by September 30th or a continuing resolution and they happen in November or December, we don't know. But this is a very hard fight, and your communication is key. You deliver the essential services to your community for all sorts of things, for reading, for education, learning technical literacy, learning financial literacy, making sure that people have a GED, making sure that entrepreneurs have access to the internet so they can market their new products, making sure that when you're in school, you get the kind of education that you need so that when you go to higher education, college or technical school, you've got the information, you can evaluate information, you can find information so that college is worthwhile. So all of these things are crucial, and they're all about your communicating to these legislatures. You are not just a book depository. You are not just a room in a school that a substitute can go into and hand out books. You are a key to children's education. You are a key to the community. So you have to communicate that. You have to bring these mopes into your facility as often as you can so that they see what you do. And when you hear things, you have to evaluate them carefully. Every president's budget is dead on arrival. This one isn't unique, but they still influence how things end up. So when you hear bad news, when you hear someone say something stupid, any person in authority, and there are oh so many who are saying stupid things all the time, you need to make sure that your community knows what's the truth in your facility. You can't help what goes on in the firehouse or the police station, but you sure as hell can make sure that what's going on in schools is preparing children for the 21st century. You can make sure that what's going on in your community, their health concerns are taken care of, they can graduate from high school, they can do what they need to do so that your community can thrive and it's a better community. So go out there and talk to these people and call your senators.
$1,000 for anybody who gets Emily to stick around another year.
All right, thank you. You know, this is, timing is everything, and I think you're probably going to be the first group marching on Capitol Hill talking about the omnibus appropriations bill. So that's great, and considering we got an increase in that bill, that's terrific news. It looks like, from what we can tell, the increase is going to go to a slight increase for the grants to states and also for the National Leadership Libraries. It looks like the Native American program and the Laura Bush program will be level funded in there. Innovative approaches to literacy appears to be level funded as well. So there is good news, and in this environment, when the president was requesting cuts in this year's, in the FY17 budget, which was absolutely dead on arrival, but any increase or level funding at this point is welcome news. And I just want to touch a little bit on the priorities of IMLS. They've made it clear that they have several priorities that they would like they would like to focus on, and they have set aside. They've said that they would put aside certain grants to deal with early learning programs, researching underserved populations, reaching underserved populations, addressing the digital capacity needs in communities, and also veterans programs. They've made a commitment to make sure that several of the grants from the National Leadership Libraries will address needs of veterans and help veterans and families work with libraries to get the resources they need, help get jobs, help get access to the benefits, help their families adjust, help them transition to civilian life. So, and as good as these numbers are, these aren't the high point. We've seen an erosion in FY 2010. IMLS, which is now 230, was at 282 million. LSTA was 213. So, like a lot of the education programs, we've seen a slow erosion of the support in Congress. So we've been fighting for every dollar that we can. What we also tried many times to stress in our meetings with offices is that there is a required state match for LSTA funding. So when the states, when there's a cut in the federal, it's also most likely a cut in the state support as well for LSTA. And these programs are popular. I was reading their report, and the National Leadership Grants, they awarded $11 million last year. They had requests for $97 million. For the Laura Bush program, they awarded $9 million in grants. They had requests for $37 million. Native Americans, they awarded about $4 million. They had requests for $7 million. So these very programs are very much in demand, very much in need. And one of the things I would say is stress is even if your library doesn't get funding, even if your library doesn't get grants in one of these areas, that allows the states to fund, to make their money go further. So even if you don't benefit, you benefit. Each state gets a portion of the Grants to States program. There's a chart on the back of the issue brief there that shows for the last 4 years what each state has gotten, and on top of that doesn't include the state match there as well. Talk a little bit about the veterans programs. They have set aside 10 pilot programs for the leadership grants that they want to, for museums and for libraries, to reach out to veterans. They also have, they wanted to create a project to help increase awareness for E-rate and address the digital capacity. But one of the things that's very important that I go into a lot of offices is to tell your story. And we've been sending information. I know Adam's going to talk a little bit about this. But we've been requesting people to send their stories to us, but it's important for you to tell their story. So when I can walk into offices, into Illinois offices, and talk about how LSTA allowed a library that lost part of its collection due to flooding was able to replace that, and in Alabama, the libraries were able to create a program for families with autistic children to help these families, help the autistic individuals be self-advocate for themselves. Some states like Montana, like Maine, use their LSTA funding to provide statewide resources. California has a program, and North Carolina, I think, also has the veterans programs where it supports the veterans there. So to be able to go into these offices and talk about these programs where LSTA touches the individuals in the state, that's always very effective to tell the story. And I encourage you at every point to tell your story and send us the stories as well. Innovative approaches to literacy, you were talking about, that's a $27 million program and appears to be level funded in the budget agreement that was announced at 2 o'clock this morning. We expect that to be voted on maybe as early as Wednesday in the House and by the end of the week in the Senate. So of the $27 million, it's the only federal program for school libraries. One half of that funding is dedicated specifically for school libraries. The other half is for national nonprofits, which could partner with libraries. ALA could or other library organizations could request grants from IAL. Promotes things like book distribution, literacy training, e-readers. I know my daughter, has always had a difficult time reading, but once she was able to get e-readers and books on tape, she really excelled at that. Replace outdated materials. So, but I also wanted to talk about how, we talk about federal funding in terms of, on your issue briefs, we talk about LSTA, innovative approaches to literacy, but, funding is a broad spectrum. It covers a number of things. ESSA, the Title IV that was authorized at $1.6 billion in the bill that was passed last year. Looks like we're probably gonna get about $400 million for that, which is, disappointing. But we have to fight for every dollar there, and we've been trying to increase awareness of that program and how libraries can, now are authorized to participate in the programs created under Title IV. But there's, things that will benefit libraries: career and technical education, Library of Congress, National Archives, government publishing offices. Some libraries may benefit from NEA or NEH funding. Agriculture, broadband grants. There's a program in the Department of Agriculture for broadband. Some of the libraries may benefit from meals from the Department of Agriculture or snacks or after-school programs, veterans, healthcare. There's a whole wide range of things that we advocate for to increase for library funding. But it's important, every library has a different story to tell, but really to tell that story, don't make the case for LSTA, make the case for innovative approaches to literacy, but talk about these other programs. If these other programs do touch you and you do benefit and you do see the return on the investment there, tell those stories. Let members of Congress know how library funding impacts their communities. And let me stop there.
Okay. Thank you, Kevin and Emily. How many people in this room have not seen that on a web page? All right. Way to go. Fight for Libraries was a concept raised by President Julie Todaro. A couple of days later, it manifested itself. That wasn't magic, and I want to thank everybody in the Washington office. It really was a complete team project, particularly the staff of the Office of Government Relations. Those of you who have been there, and that appears to be darn near everybody, very gratifying, know that this is what we are doing. That is why there are 3 asks on the back of your badge, because as Emily and Kevin have very amply explained, not everything is about money, but there ain't nothing much for things to be about without it. So that's a real awful mangling of something Ogden Nash once said about money and happiness, but you get the point. This is what we're doing on the Hill. This is what the press will understand we're doing on the Hill. It's not that the other issues, as you've heard us spend lots of time on this morning, aren't important, or we wouldn't have spent the time. But this is where, as Keith said, the rubber meets the road. Pick your metaphor. This is what makes it count. So what exactly is it? It's worth reviewing once again. Excuse me. We had a Dear Appropriator letter in the House. Basically, it's lobbying by members of Congress, lobbying other members of Congress. If you're not on the Appropriations Committee, you are a supplicant for your constituents, just like anybody else. You all are the constituents, or the proxies for the constituents, so you and we are all really supplicants. We've got to go to every member of Congress, and say, put your John and Jane Hancock on this letter and say that LSTA at this level, $186.6 million for fiscal year 2018, matters to you, Representative Foonblatz. Well, we got Representative Foonblatz. That's a good thing. He or she was probably part of that 1/3 of the House that signed the LSTA letter. It's the same process that's going on in the Senate now. We have our very long-term champion, Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island. Yeah, Jack Reed and Rhode Island, for that matter. Yeah, there we go. Okay, shameless pandering. Let the record reflect. We've got Senator Jack Reed with colleagues on both sides of the aisle, Senator Collins from Maine on the LSTA letter, Senator Grassley and Stabenow joining Senator Reed on the IAL letter. That was released into circulation in the Senate last Tuesday. So basically these people, it's not complicated. They write a Dear Colleague letter. They're very polite, right? You ever notice in the Senate, everybody's my good friend? That's because any one senator can screw up anybody else's bill. They're all pals. So, dear colleague, we're writing to you today in the hopes that you will sign the attached Dear Appropriator. We senators are supplicants for the other senators on the Appropriations Committee in support of $186.6 million for LSTA, $27 million for IAL. And you heard Kevin and others allude to it. It's the squeaky wheel, right? I was congressional staff. I was not, thank heavens, appropriations staff, because their form of hell is particularly specialized. When your boss comes to you, a member of the Appropriations Committee, and says, I'm on the Appropriations Committee so I can deliver for the people back home. They got rid of these earmarks, so I can't build the bridge with my name on it anymore, but I can make sure that this program that's going to disproportionately benefit, in the case of the Senate, the entire state, does well. Oh, that's great, boss, thanks. What do you want me to do about it? I want you to fine me $574 million because the chairman of the Appropriations Committee is going to say no unless I got it paid for. You got a week. What do? Well, Kevin lobbied for a big association before he happily came to ALA. He knows. They pull out these Dear Appropriator letters. They matter. Well, we can't cut that one because there are 200 people in favor of it. We can't cut that one in the House because there's 150 people in favor of it. We got 1/3 of the House. That's why these numbers count. So what do we want in the Senate? We've got 1/3, we think. We got to do the legwork to make sure, but we've got a base looking at last year's signers on both the LSTA and the IAL letters of about 1/3. So what do we want? We want half the darn Senate on these letters. Are you going to do it? Not without asking. Are you going to ask? What are you going to ask for? LSTA, how much? 0.6, absolutely. IAL, how much? Darn straight. We got it in FY27. We want it again in FY 2018. That's what Fight for Libraries is about. That's why telling your stories is important, as Kevin was talking about, and that's why it's important to stay tuned even after you all succeed, because you're gonna, in getting 51 senators, but not without a lot of shoe leather. So that's what we're in this for. It is the long haul. And next year we're going to have to do it again. But if we build that base gets better. And we know that for funding as well. In reviewing Emily Sheketoff's storied history with ALA, one of the things that came out, and many of you will hear tomorrow, I hope, is that the base for LSTA, working with Senator Jack Reed, was doubled by Emily some years ago. When you build the base, you build the funding, you build the career, you build communities, you build lives. You don't need me to tell you. That's what got you folks to Washington, I know. That's why we are thrilled you are here. And now I'm going to shut up and let you ask a couple of questions for a few minutes before you head off to your state delegation meetings. Who's got a question? Wow. No. I have a reputation to live down to. We cannot be ahead of schedule. That's just not going to happen. All right, yeah, I got it. Hang on 1 second. We will get you a microphone. No. We've got a streaming audience, and they need to hear you too.
Quick question on what is the LSTA fiscal 17 vote? What's the total amount of money? You mentioned it was increased by $1 million. What's the total figure?
It's 182.9 for FY16, so it's 183.9.
Thank you.
Well, question right here.
we're talking about FY 2017, but you also mentioned 2018. We're not going to be bringing that up at this point, are we?
Oh, no, let me clarify. That's a really important question. So what we've been reporting on, that's the late-breaking news, is what Congress has just finished. It's work they should have done last year. So this big omnibus bill they're about to vote on.
Yeah, what I said is we've been talking about FYI 2017, which I know Congress just approved, at 2 a.m., and I saw that. There's $231 million for IMLS, if I recall, in that. But you also mentioned 2018, and I'm, are we talking only about 2017 right now,
No,
or are we talking about both?
2018 is what Fight for Libraries is all about. The Dear Appropriator letters in the House that have circulated and we did well on were about FY18. The letters in the Senate are about FY18. All of the marathon running that we're going to need to do is about FY18. Further questions? There we go.
So do we know yet when the 2017 omnibus will be voted on?
The question is, when will the 2017 omnibus be voted on?
Yeah, we're hearing Wednesday in the House, and then Thursday or Friday in the Senate. The CR expires on Friday, so they need to do something by then. And it sounds like if they've released it, and people like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi are fairly positive about it, it sounds like they're going to have the votes.
Going once, going twice, going to state delegation meetings. Thank you, everybody.